Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Historically Speaking, an online YouTube history channel focused on the history of various institutions and professionals, how history intersects with education, culture, and the world around us. I'm Karen Yang, host of Historically Speaking. Today, joining us is Illia Blinderman, a senior journalist engineer at The Pudding. The Pudding is a digital publication that makes data fun and has published numerous award-winning articles on a lot of different cultural phenomenons that I've personally found really interesting and known that my friends have enjoyed as well. Illia, thanks so much for joining us today. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your bio or anything else you'd like to add to the pudding?
Um, yeah, maybe I'll just mention a couple of things. Uh, the Pudding is kind of an odd publication in that it's very small. We've been running for a few years, and we really try to focus on data-driven visual storytelling. And we've got a pretty unusual set of backgrounds that make up the core of the team. I started off in academia in research. I got a master's in psychiatry, and then I moved from that, kind of being a little bit more dissatisfied with the reach and some of the limitations of academia towards journalism, so towards kind of mainstream culture writing. And then
Mhm.
I'd realized I'd kind of missed some of the scientific rigor that was, uh, you know, supposed to be the bedrock of academia. And I kind of pivoted again from just general culture writing towards data journalism. And so that entails kind of a mix of some programming, some data science concepts, some, um, you know, UI work, user interface work. Um, so it's just kind of an interesting jumble of fields that make up the work that many of us do. And I've been with the Pudding since its inception. We started it in 2017. Um, I think that's probably it. Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. I think like personally, I'm really glad that you kind of covered like your own journey, I guess, to this point and how you've dabbled in both I guess more academically rigorous or not rigorous, but like academically driven kind of ideas and fields with also like journalism and what some might think of as like a softer field, I guess, in a way. And I think
Yeah.
yeah, and like I think personally that's always been something that I've kind of grappled with in terms of like what I want to do as major in college or whatever. And I guess like I wanted to ask you about that a bit. So I definitely know a lot of people always, I'm pretty sure you've also heard of the debate of like humanities versus STEM driven fields and like what these two things can look like and how they can interact with one another. I guess like because the pudding uses hard statistics and hardcore data, but kind of makes it in a more accessible way. Have you kind of seen this like humanities versus STEM kind of debate play out in your own work? And how has that kind of played out, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really kind of wide-ranging and interesting question. I guess I have a few thoughts on that matter. There's not any kind of one um, concrete example that I could point at and say yes, like here's the STEM versus the arts exemplified. I think most of the work that we do tries to communicate some of the exciting findings and some of the exciting statistical learning, some of the insights of various data sets in a way which harnesses things like narrative, things like design, things like visual appeal, a kind of almost um, like this undercurrent of pleasure that you have when you're interacting with something and it's working really well. And you have that with certain websites, or you have that with like certain physical things. If you're, you know, I wouldn't say like a fidget spinner, but like the fact that a fidget spinner like spins so well is like kind of cool, right? And so it
Mhm.
just like forces you to keep on. It doesn't force you, but it compels you to keep on playing with it and spinning it.
Mhm.
And I think similarly, things that are built in a really frictionless way help you absorb and continue interacting with their message. So, uh, one of the things that I've always thought that our visual essays should do is remove the friction between understanding and the reader.
Mhm.
So, from that standpoint, I think we try really hard to use some of the tools in the arts arsenal to showcase some of the findings that we've arrived at from the kind of STEM standpoint.
Mhm.
Um, and it's funny. I know you and I were talking a little bit before we started recording, and we kind of chanced upon the fact that oftentimes, like when numbers are taught in school, it's very difficult to impart why they're exciting,
Mhm.
why it's exciting to be able to do something with them.
Mhm.
At least when I was in high school, people would sit tests and say like, "Yeah, but I'm never going to do this again. Like, all I need to do is pass, and then like I will never need to do calculus, or like I will never need to like I don't know do algebra." And so often it's such a self-limiting idea because I never felt that way, but now I'm like, oh, I wish I'd like done more
Mhm.
math in high school, or like I did more math in college, just because it's incredibly useful. But uh, explaining to people what your capacities are as a result of that knowledge
Mhm.
is, I mean, maybe impossible, because at the very beginning, when you're in high school, your attention is kind of everywhere, right? You're doing all these different classes
Mhm.
from all these different disciplines,
Mhm.
and it's it's never that you're in a position where like you can actually achieve something really exciting that can get other people just I don't know, incredibly motivated about something as a result of you being able to solve like some problem on a math test. But
Yeah.
down the line, I mean, it's incredible that like I don't know, there are all these aspects of graph theory, or like I don't know, I get really excited about taking data and clustering it and figuring out the connections between
Mhm.
certain data points without a whole lot of input on my part, kind of revealing patterns in things that exist already. Um, but you tell that to someone, and it's very hard to communicate without actually seeing that end product,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
as to why that's exciting, and as to why that's something that can get someone out of bed in the morning. Um, and so I appreciate how difficult it is first to instruct a large classroom, and tailoring something which requires maybe a higher level of skill to a broad range of students is really hard, because maybe you'll get like a very small subsection
Mhm.
excited about the possibility of doing this, but
Yeah.
most people just don't have the kind of tools at their disposal. um, so it's something that I always try and you know dissuade people from thinking like it's I thought this when I first learned uh, a little bit of computer science, of like a little bit of programming. Like it just feels like a superpower. It's stuff that you didn't even know that you could think about doing, and then you do it. Like you can't even ask questions about certain things because you don't know that there's a possibility of doing something like that. So you don't think about the world in a way where you have this amount of agency. And it's again really tough because that's where all the fun comes in, right? Like, yeah, you set
Mhm.
up that base in high school, and then you go off and you start coding and asking questions and figuring out answers to things that you're curious about. But at the very beginning, it's just like, why are we doing this? This sucks. So
Yeah.
it's always such a shame that it's difficult to translate like the excitement that I feel to that early stage learning.
Mhm. I definitely agree. When you were talking about how you were in high school and like some of your classmates were looking at math and being like, "Oh my gosh, like whenever I'm never going to use this ever again." My sister, who's actually in seventh grade, was also like, "Oh my gosh, like do we actually use a quadratic formula like ever again, like besides, coursework or classwork?" And I think like it's actually really, really surprising to see how math and STEM kind of and the humanities definitely interact with each other quite a bit beyond, what we conventionally think about. And I think that like your work here at the pudding definitely kind of showcases that, kind of taking an artistic flair on some of the data and making it much more accessible, not only but also being able to see those connections and seeing those patterns, because I guess at the end of the day both STEM and humanities are kind of similar in that we really enjoy seeing like the patterns or like what's beyond just a number, but what can all of these numbers tell us, or who are the people behind the people putting these numbers out. And I think like personally that's what makes me super drawn to history, because I know that whatever one person did, there's always a huge narrative and a huge story behind it. And I think in a way like the numbers and the statistics are also something similar to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny if because we do separate them out all the time, right? You're like,
Mhm.
oh, I'm a creative, I'm bad at math, or like, oh, I'm a STEM kid, I'm gonna do like chemistry or whatever, right?
Mhm.
Um, and it's such a shame because I think oftentimes partly the problem just lies in the fact that like it's just hard to teach some of these things or hard to teach them well, and it's hard to convey the fact that like you don't need to be a genius to do well in a lot of these things.
Mhm.
Like if you just kind of take it slowly and like beat by beat and you go back to some of the foundations, and if you're missing that, you rebuild some of them. I mean, obviously it's difficult to know what you are bad at, but if you have some guidance that helps you figure that out, um, harnessing those STEM skills is not, any kind of superhuman feat. And given that it's not out of reach, it is one of those things that's like just incredibly useful in any context that you'll land in. Like maybe you'll have to, calculate some I don't know, something related to like a visual field. And maybe you'll have to, like we worked with designers that were fantastic coders, and
Mhm.
it's such a joy because they understand both uh, these visual aspects and like visual weight and like tone and all these other things, um, versus people that are just like, okay, I will design the thing and then you have to code everything. If
Mhm.
you can
Mhm.
speak multiple languages, like you can talk about state and functions and return values and all these other parts of programming, but you can also discuss, some of the design considerations involved, and you can talk to both specialists, as it were. Uh, you're in a much better position, and it becomes just a much more interesting experience to work on these things.
Yeah.
Um, I'm a big proponent of both. I mean, I think in part because there's so many subjective aspects of the humanities. People think like, oh, there's more room for you know, me to make a career in there.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that's the case, but sometimes like the lack of subjectivity just means that people can occasionally just like you can produce work that's not especially impressive, and
Mm-hmm.
then it'll land nowhere, and then you won't really be able to say anything as to like those results. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's much easier to be, I think, a writer that's not getting any gigs versus like a developer that's not getting any gigs with.
Mm-hmm.
So um, I think that if you have both of these things or both, you know, parts of this like whole, if we were to just say their hats, um, in your back pocket when it comes to, you know, your future career, that's ideal. You're also a much more interesting person. Like imagine
Mm-hmm.
being a mathematician that doesn't read fiction, or like a you know, a creative person that can't like do multiplication. Is it like what? How it's just, it's so it's unfortunate. It just limits the breadth of your experience. So
100%. I think like early on when you were talking about how a lot of people feel just like maybe not ready to tackle on so many different subjects, so they kind of limit themselves with that. I definitely think that a lot of us, at least you know, my peers and I personally also have felt a lot of just like, hey, like maybe I should just, you know, specialize in something, and oh, maybe that isn't necessarily for me because of how much time and how much effort it will take for me to pick something up. But I definitely also agree that, you know, taking things slowly and knowing that, you know, you can't become this like top-notch chemist or a top-notch writer like overnight is definitely really, really important. And I think that there's so much to be learned from both sides. And I think what you were talking about later on, just about how, you know, you can become a much more interesting person, and that like when a lot of people think about writing, they think about how, oh, like there may be more like I may be more lenient on me. I may not need to produce such, you know, exact or such precise, you know, work such as like someone in the STEM fields might. I also like have never, I think like what you brought up was super interesting. I never really thought of it in a way of being like, maybe this isn't really inspiring me to do my best, or isn't really inspiring me to really like create work that I guess lands, or create work that can really change someone's minds. So I think like borrowing from like STEM's relative like kind of criteria with, you know, some of the humanities like positives of, you know, being able to give you some more creativity, definitely letting them come together kind of brings out the best in both worlds, I guess.
yeah, I mean, I think like look, um, it's really easy to say that, you know, I don't know, laziness or like a lack of drive or uh, like a dearth of of you know, determination and sticking to something is just part of a creative process, and you don't have that in like the STEM fields. You either do it or you don't,
Mm-hmm.
and it's incredible to put something really impactful and really meaningful together if you're writing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also really meaningful to feel like you've solved a problem that you've encountered in some sort of STEM discipline. Like I'm constantly coming across issues when I'm, you know, working with computers just broadly, right? Like I'll come across a programming issue and it'll be infuriating, and then I'll solve it, and then I'll feel like I'm the smartest person in the world. Like, good for me, pat me myself on the back. But that's only until I come across the next problem, and then I feel like you know, a dummy all over again. And it's the cycle. So there are different kind of mental psychological incentives for yourself when you're doing these things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I Part of me though thinks that it's almost easier to derive the psychological um, satisfaction from the STEM fields
Mm,
because you have these kind of much more measurable challenges. Whereas in some of the humanities, because things are much more subjective, like maybe you post something that you've been working months on, whether it's painting or a video or again a piece of writing, and it just doesn't, it kind of gets lost, like is that thing bad then, or can you still be proud of it? Or maybe it was kind of right to get lost in the shuffle because you kind of worked on it, but then you really relied on like divine inspiration, and that's kind of it.
mm-hmm.
And then you didn't really edit it, you didn't go back and think about it, you didn't obsess over it, you didn't give any of yourself to it, but
Mm-hmm.
you just want that like
Success.
label of artist. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I think that the and obviously, I mean, look, you have to write about things that people are interested in, you have to paint things that people are interested in, you have to you know, kind of play politics to some degree, oftentimes, unless your interests really overlap with whatever's hot. So it's significantly difficult. And if you can blend some of your interests from the creative side with the STEM side and vice versa, then I think I don't know, again, you're in for a richer experience.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's pretty much all the time we have for today, but is there anything else you'd like to add about our great discussion or anything else I guess you'd just like to add?
Um, no, I don't think so. I mean, I know we initially thought we'd discuss the pudding, and then we kind of got into more abstract territory.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think if people want to check out some of the interactive stories there, to try and
Oh,
get a sense of,
yeah.
yeah, no, I'm just trying to think of like what would be a good way to exemplify things that I've been thinking about. I don't have any like one story in mind, which is why I thought maybe we'll just link out to it. Because it's one of those things that's easy to talk about at the time, but then once you go back and like reassess the conversation, then you're like, oh, maybe I should have pointed this concrete thing out, or like that story that we did. But no, I don't have anything else to add, I don't think.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much for this conversation today. It was super eye-opening, super cool as well. And to everyone watching at home, thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next interview.